How green is the digital economy? That's the topic of my conversation today with Dave Rejeski. He is visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Good. Glad to join you.
Dave, tell me about the research that the Institute had launched to just explore this question of how green is the digital economy.
Well, I think I've been in the environmental area for 35 years, and I think one of the problems that the environmental community faces is we end up in the technology space 10 years, 15 years too late. And there's reasons for that we can talk about. But I think when the environmental community comes into the technology space, they're pulled in two directions, and you can fill in the sentences. This technology, AI, nanotech, is going to destroy the planet, or it's going to save the planet. Right, and basically, the space has enormous room for misunderstandings, and I think that's really been it's not just the AI blockchain. It was a problem with synthetic biology, with nanotech, and I think that what happens in that space, we could take blockchain. If I talk to my environmental friends about blockchain, they immediately go back to the early reporting on Bitcoin mining.
Right,
so
cryptocurrencies, yeah.
Yeah, everything becomes referred to that, and this is they always see blockchain, if they're willing to engage, as a potential energy hog and a threat to our green energy future. And so you get in the environmental community, pick up on a lot of this data. It never gets corrected. I mean, last year there was some data around about streaming Netflix causes the same amount of carbon emissions as driving a car 4 miles. So that was like 1.5 kilograms. When people really dug into the data, they found it was 20 grams or less. But by then, everyone had picked up on the number, right? And it gets repeated in Wired magazine, and it goes up.
It's impossible to walk back misinformation in this era, isn't it? In so many ways. But
so I mean, part of what was driving us was we entered the space with funding from the Sloan Foundation. We were kind of agnostic. What's going on here? And we said, what's the research say? Can we find any research that goes beyond anecdotal stuff? The latest McKinsey report that was rolled out in Davos, the latest TED Talk. Was there any real research there that had been done by independents, not just by companies pushing the technology? And what we found in blockchain and sharing platforms, also in AI, is there isn't much there, even though there's a lot of questions, and there are valid questions. So there wasn't a lot of heavy research that actually quantified the environmental benefits or the risks. When we started to dig into this, there wasn't a lot of analytical rigor. The data wasn't done by multiple researchers. And so, we found that in multiple areas. And obviously, people are beginning to roll the technology out in much more serious ways now and ask these questions. But there's not enough funding. I think the other thing I would say is that the questions you're asking are really hard to answer. So it's really difficult. So I can pick up my phone, and we kind of know how much energy goes into running this,
yeah,
creating it and disposing it. But I don't know much about the environmental impact of my digital life once this is in my hand, right? And every day I'm ordering things online. I'm ordering food. I'm taking trips. So I mean, sort of trying to unpack that was something that we started to grapple with. But I would say that this question of how green it is, we don't know, and there's not enough money or effort being spent. I would say the philanthropy world isn't putting much effort into this. The government is certainly not doing enough. It's going to be a difficult research problem. It's going to take a fair amount of money, and it requires multiple. It's not just an engineering problem.
I'm really quite shocked to hear you say that, although I guess it does make sense that the organizations that would undertake that research, each of them would have their own particular axe to grind. And I guess that's what's happening here. But you emerged from this with a healthy admission that you don't have all the answers. But I'm just wondering, in terms of any tentative conclusions, let me direct you to a policy report that you co-authored a couple of years ago under the title of Blockchain Salvation. Did that title accurately represent your view of the technology's potential, or was there an ironic twist to the title? Tell me what you meant by that.
I think I sort of gave some credibility to the hype factor, and there's always a hype factor. I have nothing against that, right? But I've been a huge supporter of blockchain for years now, and I've really been trying to get the environmental community to engage in the discussion about blockchain that goes beyond Bitcoin. and begins to think about what are the implications of blockchain for setting up peer-to-peer energy markets, for doing better supply chain management, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
And we did a big report for the United Nations on this. But blockchain is a very heavy lift, I think, because people are just A, because of Bitcoin, and B, because it seems like it's something they can't understand.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's try to divorce blockchain from Bitcoin a little bit in this discussion. Now, with Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrency, you have miners who, as you point out, are taking up immense amounts of energy in order to secure these digital coins. Blockchain is about a distributed ledger that can be indeed distributed over multiple millions of computers or thousands, depending on the particular application. That sounds like it might be a little bit of an energy suck. Is it been your conclusion that it's not as much as the cryptocurrency mining? And if so, how much is it?
I mean, we did support some researchers that looked at this, and I think their general conclusion was that it probably uses a lot less energy, depending on essentially you don't have to distribute it over as many computers if you don't want to. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you could set up private blockchains that are less energy intensive. There's a bunch of tricks now that the blockchain community has learned to reduce the energy use. Mm-hmm. And I think that the challenge for the blockchain community, and whether you're using it to trace fish from being caught to the table, or reduce waste in the plastics area, whether you're using it for energy markets, is just going to be how to take it to scale, right? And that's a proverbial problem.
Because so many programs are in pilot still. We're not seeing a lot of full applications of blockchain yet.
There's a lot of pilots, and I think that's great. I mean, I think it's phenomenal that everybody's experimenting.
Yeah.
And you look at the people, I mean, in the end, I don't think it's a technology problem, it's an organizational problem. And it's all about interoperability and standards. Standard. How do you actually develop a way for these systems to talk to one another, especially if you're doing a very long and heterogeneous supply chain where you've got lots of different actors, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be a problem. So some of the people I think that have been successful early on were like the reinsurance companies. They created their own standard setting body, and they're going out and trying to set the standard so their companies can exchange the data. And I think those are the people that will succeed early. But I'm bullish about blockchain. I think the energy use will be far less as we go forward. It's the same thing. You probably remember the huge amount of terror around data centers, maybe 10 years ago. Right?
That was my next question, Dave. Can I ask that and have you tell me what you think? I mean, in the age of cloud computing, with these massive server farms out there in order to support AWS and similar types of services, is that not a challenge environmentally in terms of energy use?
Yeah, but I think a lot of, if you go back, I think one of the things that worked there is you had people, Lawrence Berkeley Labs did studies on data centers going back 10, 15 years. So you had sort of independent people looking at this. And I think that was useful. And if you go back and look at the projections 10 years ago, it was 25% increase in energy consumption per year, right? It was terrifying, mm-hmm. Right? Now it's down to 4%. And as you know, a lot of the data centers, a lot of those are running on renewables now. So I think there was, people recognized it early. There was people that got engaged. And I think the other thing that, one of the things that came out of the blockchain discussion was there was a need to kind of come up with ways of measuring, standardized ways of measuring how much these systems were using. So you put it on a standard piece of hardware, you do measurements under the same load, right? So that you get consistent data. And I think that's something that will be useful. It's just best practices and how do you measure the energy being used by blockchain.
But it sounds like you're again telling me that nobody quite knows in terms of like the amount of energy that these server farms take, the amount of heat that they give off, the possible carbon emission implications. I mean,
the server farms, the energy output is reduced. The interesting thing about the server farms is that people have begun to use a lot of AI in the farms, and so they put thousands of sensors in the data centers, and they monitor almost every single server. And that allows them to reduce the cooling load exponentially. I've worked with a lot of companies that just they make money by just going into server farms and saying, we're going to outfit your server farms with machine learning algorithms and sensors, and we can reduce your energy use by 40, 50%.
I
Because a lot of it's coming from the cooling. They're running so hot, and they overcool because it's critical infrastructure. You don't want them to go down.
Oh, I see. So the sensors are setting the proper cooling levels that match their need as opposed to overdoing it.
And
Interesting.
the sensors, I mean, the servers are running optimally, but with just the right amount of cooling.
Right.
So that's an incredibly interesting application of AI, I find.
Uh-huh. And AI in general, you laid out those two extremes at the beginning of our conversation, the end of civilization or the salvation of civilization. I take it you're coming down somewhere in the middle or kind of a tentative feel about it?
I think there's certainly I think one of the interesting things that we're working on now is just this issue of how much energy is used to train AI algorithms, right? So we have to train these machine learning algorithms, especially for voice, we're doing voice translation systems, image recognition, and it's not trivial. But the AI community, I think, is beginning to look at this. But you sort of have to, this is an interesting story about the environmental people have to sort of put this on the table and come up with a way to get the AI, the machine learning, essentially the machine learning community to say, it's not just optimizing the algorithms for efficiency and speed, but I also want to make them energy efficient. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think it goes back to the initial discussion we were having at the beginning is how do you get the environmental people engaged early on? Because I found if you do that, a lot of the tech folks are more than glad to put this into the equation. But you have to engage early on.
There's an iterative quality to what you're saying, because in a way you're almost implying that we're going to require AI to tell us how to save energy required to have AI.
Right. Yeah.
It's sort of referring to it itself in a way, because we can't handle the job ourselves, and so we're asking the machine to do it.
My goal, my idea was to have, essentially AI algorithms that were actually, if it was in a car, the AI algorithm would be monitoring the emissions and making sure it was in compliance with the law, or it was beyond compliance. I mean, that would be a wonderful thing. Essentially, AI becomes, the learning is focused not only on efficiency and getting us through the traffic, it's focused on the best environmental outcomes we can do.
A lot of the things you're saying, Dave, are really quite positive in nature. Do you have any concerns, if you did have any concerns about the negative aspect of the digital economy on the environment, what might that be?
I think one of the things I worry about is that it's not accessible by enough people, right? And that's just a proverbial problem in the digital economy. We supported a project in Austin, Texas. Austin was one of the, or actually Texas, or Austin was a community that kicked out Uber and Lyft. This was about 3 years ago, I guess, because of their lack of doing adequate background checks on their drivers. This was a few weeks before the South by Southwest conference, that huge convergence of all kinds of people in Austin, around Austin. And I think within 3 or 4 weeks, there were 5 startup firms that were doing ride sharing that filled the space. And one of them still exists. And we did a study of that. And it's interesting because we were actually interested in the environmental benefits. We were also asking the question, what happens, because these people own their own system. It's all Facebook based. And instead of having a large company that's running their ride sharing system, it's just the local people. So it's actually what people call a platform cooperative.
Yeah.
So essentially you have some of the benefits of the environmental benefits on top of the ownership benefits that is loaned locally by the people who actually use the system.
More of a peer-to-peer thing than having Lyft or Uber sit in the middle of it and be kind of the center of it all.
So I do think, I mean, I think there's a tremendous, we did some work with an app that's used to reduce food waste by allowing people to share food.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting, during the pandemic, the use has actually gone up. And it has environmental implications because you keep the food waste out of the landfills. But in this country, somewhere around, there's been about a 200% increase in mothers not having adequate food for families and for their kids.
Mhm.
So I'm always interested in things that help the environment plus other things, whether it's the economy or it has wider social benefits.
I would be very interested in touching base with you at some point in the future as your research into this progresses, because it sounds like there's a lot more to be done and a lot more conclusions to be reached based on more thinking and research on your part and the part of your peers. So, but in the meantime, David Rejeski, thanks so much for bringing us up to date on where we are now in terms of your attempts to assess the greenness of the digital economy without having a particular axe to grind on either side. Thanks very much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.